I think it was 1984, there were 34% of women in computer science, and now there's 18%. It's been a huge drop off, and yet it's the one field, or one of the few fields where women and men, their salary is about equal.
Welcome to the Cybrary podcast.
Well, welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome. Well, welcome back.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Ryan Corey, CEO and co-founder of Cybrary, and I'm excited for you to join us on today's episode. Let's jump in. Hi, and welcome back to Cybrary's podcast. I'm your host, Mike Gruen, VP of Engineering and CISO here at Cybrary, and today we're joined by Tina Kuhn. Tina, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. I'm Tina Kuhn, the president of CyberCore Technologies.
Cool, and what does CyberCore Technologies do?
So CyberCore specializes in supply chain security. And what I mean by that, it's really looking at electronic equipment and the supply chain, how it's being made, how it's being transported, to make sure that it's not counterfeit, to make sure that what should be in the equipment is in there, that there isn't anything extra that's doing any malware. So we bring equipment into our building, we scrape the BIOS, we do some cyber testing, we check to make sure the serial numbers, the network cards, they're all consistent with what the manufacturer has told us should be there. And then we package it up and then send it securely to our customers. So one of the things we also do, which is interesting, is we look at every vendor that we do business with. So every manufacturer or distributor, anybody we buy software or hardware from, we do a whole analysis of risk factors on that company. So we have about 150 threat vectors that we look at, and we use some artificial intelligence, some machine learning. We also look at about 115 languages. We have some natural language processing. So we basically scrape the internet, dark web, deep web, and find things out about companies to assess their risk. So some of the things we look at is, are the leadership, do they have nefarious contacts with foreign governments that are enemies of the United States? Are they in legal trouble? Are they in financial trouble? What's their cyber profile? Can we find things on the deep and dark web that shows they've been breached? So we do a report, basically we do a risk report on every company we do business with in order to reduce the threats of something happening to the equipment before it gets to us.
Cool. And I think it's interesting because, supply chain is in the news these days with SolarWinds. And obviously it's a very different type of supply chain. And there's the physical supply chain, which I think people sort of forget about. I think they, or maybe not, I don't know, take for granted. But yeah, I think it's interesting. And to think about, like, are there lessons we can learn from one or the other? Like, how does the hardware supply chain security and what lessons maybe could software use and vice versa? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. So, we tend to look at cybersecurity as network security. Right. There's a lot of network tools, and yet it's a much bigger issue than what we think of. I mean, look, right now you can put malware in power cords that can exfil data out from your equipment that's not on your network. You can put malware or some device into equipment before it even, and it comes in a box that looks like it's the manufacturer, but it could be tampered with, right? So, and I think SolarWinds has been a really good example of how much bigger the scope of cyber attacks is than what we typically think of. And the only silver lining I can see with the SolarWinds hack is it's opening people's eyes up to what the complexity and the how smart our enemies are to try and get into our systems.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, right, if there's a positive that comes from it, it's the ability to go into a boardroom or into wherever, or to upper management or wherever, and say, this is a risk, this is actual impact, this is no longer a theoretical risk, it's an actual, it's a proven thing. It's one thing to say, there's bad weather and there's hurricanes that happen and there's a possible flood or whatever, but after it happens and you sort of see the devastation, you can see that, makes it a lot easier to talk about, even though it's not what you want. You'd much prefer that you could have that abstract. And I think it is interesting to think about like the similarities between physical and virtual, like the same types of like things that you can do in terms of inserting something into a box, right? The physical like hardware, right? Well, that's exactly the same problems that you have with software dependencies. It's somebody injecting something into this package. I mean, they're actually called packages, in libraries and things like that. And it's a very similar thing. And yeah, when you're talking about outlets and things like that, I bought a device that sits between my for charging, so that for a USB charger that only allows electricity through. It doesn't allow any data as like a thing, because if I want to go to the airport and use one of the USB chargers or something that's already there, you have no idea, like, is that the real thing, that people can tamper with it. And so that was one of the, I was traveling and I wanted to make sure. And I think that's, there's little things that people can do, but they don't even realize they need to do or should do.
Right. Oh, I think people don't think about, when they get a box, that looks like it's a manufacturer box, it's packed like it came from the manufacturer. They assume that it's from the manufacturer, but, there's lots of counterfeit out there that has the same packaging capability. And yet we had one customer that they bought the lowest. They went out and did a low cost bid for a bunch of, actually it was a bunch of servers, got them in. It was counterfeit that had malware on it. They had got malware all through their network. It cost them millions to clean it up.
Right. It cost them way more, probably.
Oh yeah, they probably saved, maybe $30,000 going to the low cost, and it cost them millions to do the cleanup. So I think we need to really look at our, what we're electronics, our electronic equipment, our software, everything that goes onto our system. I think we need to look at and figure out where it comes from. So yeah. we had one company that we were, we did our own risk analysis on it, and it was a software company, and we found US-based company, because we have a lot of government contracts, so we have to be very careful. It looks like a US company, leadership is US company, but we found all the software was being done by people that had close ties with the Russian government, right? So, and you wouldn't know that with just a search of the company, because they put it out for contractors to do their software. They didn't do the software in-house, and who they hired were citizens of a country that is not friendly to the US. So I think we need to really think about both our hardware and software supply, where it all comes from. We're a global world, but yet, and we get software and hardware from all sorts of places. And I think we just need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think what was eye-opening for me was I was working government contractor. We had a contract with NSA, I believe. And we had to, there was some hardware that needed to be purchased to be put into an environment. Sorry, I'm trying to not give out too much information. Anyway, the short version was like, that's when I became aware of like everything that went into looking at that hardware and making sure that it was actually what it's supposed to be. We were like, oh, we should buy it needs a bigger hard drive. And they were like, well, make sure to do that. Like, it didn't even, that's when I started doing more and more research and learned like, oh yeah, these hard drives that you're buying, whether it's, big box store or whatever, potentially has malware pre-installed on it, ready to go, in hopes that it's going to end up in some system that's meaningful. Like, chances are nobody cares about what my home system, but there's still that threat. And I think that was pretty eye-opening, was to learn about that supply chain and how vulnerable it is. I think at that same time was when I learned about, there was a story about Cisco, I think, where there were black market goods being inserted into their supply chain that caused all kinds of problems. And do you know more about that story? Because I only know it sort of from the outside. I imagine you probably have more information than I do.
Yeah, so this was maybe a year and a half ago. About 30% of what people thought they were buying with Cisco was really counterfeit. So, so companies would buy a Cisco router, and when you have a router, that's like the keys to the kingdom, right? And so Cisco has done a good job at kind of cleaning that up and routing that out. But at one time, there was a lot of counterfeit that was coming in, and basically coming in through distributors, coming in through other places. And people thought they were buying it from Cisco, but the distributors and other. So the way hardware is typically routed, it goes from the manufacturer to a distributor. It's kind of a middleman. And they have it in their warehouses for a long time. And then it gets sold to, either somebody that's going to integrate it or the end customer, right? So you have this, you have a pretty complex chain when it goes from the manufacturer to when it gets to the customer, sometimes two hops, 3 hops. And so each one of those places need to be secured.
Right.
And so Cisco has really cleaned that up, but it's every manufacturer has that issue where there's a lot of counterfeit out there. And you just have to be careful what you buy and make sure your distributors are top notch, and they're ones that treat security with the utmost, what's the right word? Tell me the right word.
Yeah, I mean, it's right, high priority or whatever. Yeah,
right,
I hear you.
Utmost priority.
Right. But that's funny that, because you said it was a year and a half ago, but I seem to recall the story that I'm thinking of was probably closer to 10 years ago. So it must be I mean, it's clearly a recurring problem of securing these things, and not to, I mean, right, as you said, I'm not trying to pick on Cisco. I think every manufacturer has problems.
Right. When they have a lot of good security, but once it leaves their facility, it goes to FedEx or UPS or, whoever is delivering it, or it goes to an Amazon or Walmart or, whatever retail place or another distributor, and then it sits in their warehouse. Do they have all US citizens there? Who's touching the equipment there? Can they swap out counterfeit goods? Can they, there's a complex set of steps, and then you have the transportation.
Right.
We do track the equipment that comes into our building very closely, and we've had times where we've lost track of a truck because their GPS went down or something happened, and we refuse to take that equipment.
So I was going to ask is so are you guys checking 100% of the stuff? Are you doing sampling? How do you I don't know how much equipment you're getting, but it seems like doing 100% would be problematic. It would be.
Right. It depends on the customer. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of different customers that have different risk profiles. So some of them want 100% check. Some of them want kind of a basic, just serial number check, but not a deep interrogation. Mm-hmm. We have one customer, we have something new that we're rolling out, and it does a hardware interrogation of every single thing in that box. And then we have from the manufacturer what is in that box.
Like
so
a
we
manifest?
Yeah, it's more like a bill of material.
Right.
It's a list of what's in there, so we can tell if even some of the smaller parts in there are counterfeit or not. So that takes, and then if we find something, we take the box open, which is pretty intrusive. So you don't want to do that for everyone.
Right.
And then we have a machine vision that can basically looks at a picture of the inside of the box and then compares it to what the manufacturer has given us to what should be there to see. We can tell even if there's a different color in the metal. We can tell if there's something that's implanted there that shouldn't be there, things like that. So that's kind of the deepest level that we have. So we do the kind of the scanning first and see if there's any anomalies that we see. And then we can, if we are, then we can do the actual machine vision part, which is a little more intrusive.
So aside from governments, who else, like what other companies or what types of industries are you guys working with?
So Cybercore is mainly a government contractor. Okay. We have contracts with about 17 different agencies, but we're just starting to get some more commercial contracts, mainly with companies that do business with the government because they are willing to pay for deeper checks.
Right.
Because they're
held
because
to
of the
standard.
risk.
Right. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just filling out some paperwork the other day that was attesting to the fact that we don't use hardware from certain places, and like luckily these are not problems for us because of what we do, but it was easy to get through that. But I could imagine other manufacturers or other government suppliers. So do you think, I mean, like I'm always fascinated by like OT, operational technology, and like whether it's infrastructure or cars and stuff like that. Are similar companies as you like to you guys, are they involved in helping those manufacturers, like the people like for critical infrastructure or transportation? Is the same sort of stuff happening there, or am I getting on a 50% compromised plane that has lots of counterfeit materials?
So critical infrastructure, it's a huge topic now.
Right.
Because you just saw the breach in the water facility in Florida. You know, it's a lot of older systems. They haven't had the cybersecurity that they really
they were never meant to be. They were built before the internet. They were never designed to be online. So.
Right. So they're starting to. So that's starting to get a lot of attention as our critical infrastructure. But I believe things like planes, they've had lots of security for a long time. But I think some of the other parts of our infrastructure, not so much, because it's low cost. You know, our electrical grid, our water system. You know, I think there's 18 critical infrastructure areas that the government. But what I'm seeing right now is the government is starting to look at that. And they're putting money toward helping the critical infrastructure get their cybersecurity up to the level that it should be. And it's starting, and I think the SolarWinds was also highlighted the supply chain risk and the critical infrastructure risk. So I'm happy about that, that there's more attention, but I think there is a risk in our critical infrastructure right now.
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely is, and I think it's funny when I think about it a little bit. Like, I did a podcast not that long ago about voting machines and voting security and stuff like that, which is probably part of the same thing. But one of the supposed advantages that our voting system has is that it's this distributed system. Every county does it differently. It would be impossible to hack. I won't get into like why. Because of the electoral college, it doesn't really matter. There's like 4 counties. You just have to hack 4 counties to take an election. But anyway, a national election. But the same thing that makes that system resilient is exactly what makes like our critical infrastructure so hard to secure, because there's a bazillion systems, and it's at all these. You have the city water, you have the county water, you have the state, and then you have and so that it's not so easy to figure out who's responsible for it, get the money in the right hands. Do they even have the resources to do what's necessary? I think is a big challenge.
Right. But you know that a lot of them go to the same manufacturers to buy the same type of equipment. So if you go back to the source, again, to the supply chain, if you go back to where They're getting all of their software. There can't be that many, water control software systems
Let's hope not.
out there, right?
Right.
So, while it's distributed, there's still a limited amount of sources of that. So, there's always a risk.
That's great. It's very rare that I walk away from these conversations feeling slightly more optimistic. So thank you for that. So yeah, I think, one thing you and I were talking before this, is just sort of about our backgrounds and our careers and how we got to where we are. And, I don't want to skip over that. I think we could talk all day about, supply chain and stuff like that. I don't know what our audience's tolerance for that is, but I am sort of curious about your background a little bit and where you came from and how you got into your role. Cause I think it seems like a pretty unique journey.
So I started out as a software engineer. My first job, way cool job, was programming a Landsat satellite at NASA. And then I just ended up in cybersecurity through the offensive side. And then, I've just stayed in cybersecurity the rest of my career. Actually, I was in there before it was called cyber. I remember when that term came up, so I'm dating myself. But yeah, I just think it's a fascinating field. I think it's always evolving, so that it makes it interesting. So I would like to, I'll just get on my high horse for a minute, but I would like to just talk about women in cyber. In the late 70s and kind of early to mid 80s, there was a huge push to get women into engineering fields. I saw a statistic in, I think it was 1984, there were 34% of women in computer science, and now there's 18%. It's been a huge drop off. And yet it's the one field, or one of the few fields where women and men, their salary is about equal. A lot of other professions, it's unequal between men and women, and the technical fields, they're ones that you can work remote. There's they're higher salaries, there's huge advantages. And I would just like to encourage anybody who's a woman or has women or girls in their life to encourage a career in some type of cyber engineering field.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. I didn't know that statistic. I didn't realize that things had actually dropped. And but I do agree, like, it's one of the most flexible in terms of your ability to work when you work, like, and in terms of the flexibility, because there's so many different places where so many different sized organizations that can use, whether it's cybersecurity engineer, software engineer, testing, whatever it is in technology. There's so many different things. And it's so many, like, all these different types of companies that you can usually find, like, you can find a job that fits your lifestyle, what you want to do, how, your career, your goals, and your life goals. And then on top of it, like, there's all these different types of problems to solve. And software engineering is a particular type of problem of building things. Cybersecurity is protecting those things. Testing is figuring out how they break and helping the rest of the group understand how to have them break gracefully, or break, at least understand how they're going to break. And then you decide what you're going to do with that information. And, in design, there's so much, I think, I like that, like, I guess I'm climbing up on your high horse. I like that engineering isn't just math. And I think that that's a big, like, my background. So I have a comp sci degree, but I minored in English, essentially almost a double major. And almost everything I did was in poetry, like writing poetry workshops and creative writing. And the number of engineers I work with who aren't particularly mathy, but are super creative, whether they're musicians or artists or whatever, I would say, depending, there's 80-90% of what you're doing is creative problem solving or creativity. And I think, we put so much emphasis on STEM in terms of math, like the math part of STEM, when really I think science in general has a lot of creativity. And I think that that's not talked about enough. And I'd encourage people to really get involved. I think there's so many different avenues for you to get involved in a technology field, and it's not necessarily just coding.
Right. But, that's a great point, and thank you for bringing that up. And yet, to get a degree in computer science, you have to get through some heavy math, and you have to have it in high school.
Right.
And to get it in high school, you basically have to do it in middle school. So, I think our colleges need to change. So what I am seeing is a great trend is I'm seeing a lot of 2-year degrees and certifications in cyber, and companies hiring people that have certifications and not necessarily a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree plus certifications. So I think that's opening the field up a little bit to people that are either changing careers or people where 4-year degree is difficult either because of money or time or
yeah, I don't even know what the
whatever.
return on that investment is. I mean, frankly,
Right.
like I went to Maryland. I have a CS degree. I wouldn't change anything that I've done. And I learned a lot. I learned how to learn languages. I learned like computer science, which it sometimes is very helpful. But in terms of like as a software engineer or as a cybersecurity person, like I've worked with some of the best engineers I've ever worked with or cybersecurity professionals I've ever worked with had zero, like didn't go to college. They went into the army and then got some skills there, or they went directly into working. And so or they have a liberal arts degree and they're, very creative. They have an art background or whatever, and they started doing UI, they started doing some design, and they're like, oh, this is interesting. Right. And then they started learning HTML, and you start learning, oh, look, I can actually make something that does more than this. And I think that a comp sci degree is helpful in some cases, certainly not required. I think there's so much that you can learn without that degree, and be very successful in technology at any number of levels. There's so many different, even if you're technically challenged, there's so many careers in technology where you can fit, from product management and project management and like just helping to corral cats. I mean,
yeah. So let me give you one example. I had a team of hackers that I had working for me. They were good guy hackers, right. But on the team was a sociologist, right? Because it was a really important function to look at the social part of, create these honeypot websites, to look at who the enemies are from a social point of view. That's what spear phishing is. It's doing social engineering. This was be on the other side. But there's jobs that aren't technical. And even, I think I agree with you completely. I don't think the heavy math is required to do a good job. And, the system administration of every single company is the first line cyber person.
Yeah.
They may not have a cyber title, but that system administrator is the one that's helping to protect the company.
Yeah, I mean, tying it back to what we talked about in the beginning, even sourcing that hardware, like, hey, rather than buying the third-party charger, go ahead and buy the actual manufacturer charger, because you might be saving the company a few bucks, but are you? Those types of things. And I know that those chargers, for example, even if you're not worried about from a cybersecurity perspective, just they fail faster, they burn things out, they don't meet the specifications. There's reasons not to buy them. But I think, again, it's that same, you're that front line and everything. I think there's lots of opportunity for lots of people. I would love to get more people in general in cyber, but specifically women. I think there's great organizations out there we have relationships with, and there's plenty of them out there. There's WISEG. I always forget the acronyms, but Women in Cybersecurity and others. And I encourage people to go and check those out.
The Women in Cybersecurity is amazing. I'm actually part of the leadership of the Critical Infrastructure affiliate chapter.
Oh.
So it's a great organization. It does a lot of mentoring, helping to find jobs for women, training, provide avenues to get training. So I would encourage any woman to sign up and be a part of that organization. It just has a lot of great resources.
That's great to know. Yeah, and we do a lot with them as well. We love working with them. So yeah, that's great to know. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. Any final thoughts? Any parting words?
No, thank you very much. And it was so much fun to be here. And I appreciate the time.
Yep. Thanks again.